part of my project is to just encourage people to think about uniquenesses. And that goes back to opposite of stereotyping. I really believe in the pernicious impact of stereotyping, and that it's a simple way of understanding dehumanization. You're treating people as objects, or you're grouping them unfairly. Try doing the opposite of that. Try doing uniqueness thinking for a while. It's going to be therapeutic. It's going to be helpful, I think.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with John Stewart as we take a communication perspective on what he calls co-constructing uniqueness. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. The hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, John Stewart. I'll direct you to the show notes to read a more complete overview of John's work, but for now, I'll start us off by sharing that John has been hugely influential in the field of communication. John has published a number of meaningful books, including Bridges, Not Walls, a book about interpersonal communication, and his most recent book, Dismantling Racism One-on-One, Uniqueness Narrative Equity. This is the last conversation in our series about showing up, and this has felt like a really generative and meaningful series for me. I'm loving the way that all these episodes are interacting and interrelating, and I'm hoping that you're getting that sense as well. I think that this episode will really just solidify that for us, because this is a great way to wrap it all up and send us on our way as we continue to try to live out what we've been learning this month. So let's finish the conversation off with John. Hi, John. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I've really been looking forward to it.
Hi, Abby, and I'm looking forward to it too. It's great to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to hear everything you have to say today. So I say we jump into it. Sure. And to start, please introduce yourself. And you know that that's all about stories. And so share some stories about who you are and help us have a little bit of an understanding as we go into this conversation today about who you are, John.
Sure. Well, right now I'm a retired academic. I'm living in the Midwest with my wife. I was a professor of communication at the University of Washington for 32 years. And then in 2001 decided I wanted to move from a state-supported to a Christian institution. And so I came to the University of Dubuque in Dubuque, Iowa, served as vice president for academic affairs there. My interest until 2016 when I retired, my interest over that time has been in interpersonal communication and philosophy. So my degree is in those two disciplines, and I've been particularly interested in philosophy of dialogue. I've been, besides being a teacher, I've maintained a consistent practice training architects and engineers especially, but also lots of other professional groups, health sciences people, attorneys, elected officials, or people running for office. And so it's been important to me to connect the philosophical ideas, the theoretical interests that I have with very practical ones. That's been one of my emphases throughout my professional life. In the last 20 years, I've focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Black-white racism in the United States is an extremely important and vital topic from my perspective, and I'm trying to do what I can as an old white guy to talk particularly to people who, like me, call themselves white and are unaware of, I think, a lot of the experiences from people who don't have a voice and aren't as whose perspectives aren't as well known as those. As a result of white supremacy, those of us who are part of that, our voices are more prominent. So, written some books and some articles and a variety of other activities that academics normally participate in, so we don't get fired. That publish or perish. So I'm enjoying retired life now, and trying to stay engaged with the Academy, publishing articles and books, and doing some consulting, but not as much as I used to. So that's me.
That's a wonderful start.
I'm trying to say, who are you? But I know that's not our topic.
I'm hoping that I'll, get to share some about myself as this conversation emerges too. And one little nugget I'll share off the bat is that my heart is with interpersonal communication as well. So I think that's a shared kind of foundation for us. So I'm curious if there's an experience or a few experiences that you can remember that led you to be interested specifically in interpersonal communication early on.
When I reflected on this, of course, I wasn't aware at the time, but my mom was profoundly deaf. And I think I learned as a very young child how, if I wanted to experience the kind of nurturing and thriving that a young person wants to experience, I needed to make contact with my mom, and I needed to be proactive in that process, because if she wasn't looking at me, she couldn't hear me. We didn't sign. We didn't know ASL, and so she read lips very well. But I learned the importance of attending, focusing, orienting your body, hers and mine, eye contact, pauses, creating contextual possibilities of being in contact, being close enough, waiting for a break in the ambient noise, those subtle little things that I didn't have any names for at the time, of course, became apparent to me kind of viscerally as a young person, because if I didn't practice communication, effective communication strategies, I guess somebody who studied it would call it, I didn't have that contact that was so important. And so for me, communication has been about the relationship between the quality of my communicating and the quality of my life throughout my academic life, that it's not just about persuading people, and it's not just about talking in public, and it's not just about expressing ideas, and it's not just about selling products or even teaching. It's about who we are. I published an article, the title of which was Speech and Human Being, and that kind of reflects this interest of mine that grew out of my own life experience.
Yeah, that resonates with me, that what I'm hearing in the core of what you're saying is that it was this kind of seeing yourself as the, participant in your social world, is that CMM-ish language that we'd use to say, oh, I have a choice. And the choices I make, we're starting to draw those connections very young, that the choices I make about how I interact, the body language, the turning towards each other, being cognizant of all these different elements, that has an effect on the quality of life I live and the relationship I have with my mother specifically.
Sure. And making social worlds. I mean, that articulates part of the experience too. I'm an agent in the making of my own social world. And it's the choices I make are just really critical. And so as you, I'm sure, if you're interested in interpersonal communication, we want, when we're helping others learn about interpersonal communication, that's what's at stake. How we're co-constructing social worlds.
Yeah, to me, that's kind of that fundamental shift that has to happen for people to really embody a communication perspective. Because I think a lot of people see themselves as passive, or haven't, been taught to look at communication in this way and see their own role in it. And so to start to see yourself as an active participant with choices who is creating the social world is kind of that foundation that I think that can kind of open the door to everything else.
Yeah, let me try something, because you use a word that I've been alerted to. I would say constructing social world rather than creating social world, because for me, the term creating can mean from whole cloth. And we construct it in the sense that we bring materials to it, our own life experiences, past interactions, the ways our identity has been shaped in other experiences that we've had. And so is that a distinction that makes a difference to you or not?
I have used them interchangeably and probably use co-create more for no good reason. And so I appreciate the distinction you're making, because I think it is true that kind of existing materials that we are using, I'm thinking of like, a child sitting with a lot of blocks of Legos or something around and saying, okay, here is what I've been given. And like, that's the stories we tell and the ways we've been taught to interact with each other and the cultures we live in and the layers of context, that CMM would talk about. And they say, okay, what am I going to do with what I've been given? Because it really is that, like, you shape the social world shapes you, and you can make new meaning and build new things, but you do still start, like you're saying, with these kind of elements that have been handed down to you because of the social world you exist in. So I think I'll be using co-construct from now on.
Super. Well, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. So talking about this communication perspective, I'm curious to start talking about the work you're doing now. It seems you've stayed very busy, even in retirement, and I'm thankful for that and your continued work. I want to know about the work you're doing right now with Uniqueness and what's coming up for you right now around that work.
One of the decisive paragraphs, I guess, I read that began to shape the work I'm doing now in Uniqueness was written by a philosopher who's been influential to me, is a Jewish philosopher named Martin Buber, who in 1921 wrote a book called I Am Thou, which at one point, I think in the 70s or 80s, was third in worldwide sales, only to the Bible and the Quran. I mean, this is a book translated into 25 different languages and so on. And one of the points that Buber wants to make is that he's talking about speech and human being, about who we are as human beings and how that's connected with our contact with others. And in one kind of delightful place, I think he writes, an animal is what it is unquestionably. And so we don't have any evidence that animals kind of reflect on, am I doing a good job being a cat parent?
Yes.
And human beings do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So an animal is what it is unquestionably. It's different with humans. And then he says, secretly and bashfully, we watch for a yes which allows us to be and which can come to us only from one human being to another. And then he concludes this essay, it is from one human to another that the heavenly bread of self-being is passed. Well, it's really flowery 19th century language, originally written in German. But the idea is it is an individual contact that is distinctively human and person building. And so reading that, and that kind of stayed with me sort of in the back of my head. And then the experience that prompted the actual work was reading a book that in my community, the Community Foundation purchased 500 copies of a book called Picking Cotton. And the book was about a story about Jennifer Thompson Canino and Ronald Cotton. Jennifer was brutally raped by a black man when she was a college student. And Ronald was selected by the police to be put in the lineup, even though he had nothing to do with it. Jennifer picked him out of the lineup. And as a result of her identification, he was convicted and he spent 9 years in jail. Only after a DNA evidence and a confession exonerated him did Jennifer and Ronald speak to each other. This book, Picking Cotton, kind of a clever title,
right,
tells a story of what led up to this and the conversation they had, and then what came after the conversation. Because afterwards, not only did they co-author this book together, but they became partners in a political campaign to increase the amount of remuneration somebody gets who's been unfairly convicted. So they also showed up in our community on a stage responding to questions for 2 hours to an audience of about 300 people. So was really remarkable. I mean, and the conversation was a turning point in their lives, obviously. And when he reports on this conversation, one of the things that Ronald said, Jennifer came into the room where they were going to meet, and she said, Ronald, I don't know what to call you. If I spent my whole life saying how sorry I am, I don't know what I could say. Can you ever forgive me? And Ronald, for a variety of reasons, forgave her and then said, I'm not going to be following you around looking to see if what you're doing. You don't have to worry about that, kind of reassuring her. And then Ronald talks about how Jennifer looked at him when he said that. And at one point in his description, Ronald says, she saw me. Mm. And that was a decisive experience for him. And that goes about from one human to another, the heavenly bread of self-being is passed. He said, no longer was I this violent black rapist. And as a result of the conversation, no longer was she this lying white bitch, which had been the stereotypes each had of the other. But they were persons to each other, individuals, unique persons to each other. So that really intrigued me. So I worked at unpacking that conversation and wrote with a colleague of mine, Jody Koenig-Kellis. We wrote a piece about that event, and came up with a terrible jargon name, Co-constructing Uniquenesses. Because it seemed to me if we looked at their conversation, that's what they were doing. I wish I could name it a different way, but they were together. They were constructing it, as you and I just talked about. And what they were co-constructing was uniquenesses, who they were, their identities to each other in this situation, in this context. And as a result of the co-constructing of uniquenesses, those identities replaced the stereotypes. And those because stereotypes, of course, come from grouping. And what they have done is co-construct uniquenesses. So it's like the opposite. It's like 180, so the other end of the continuum from stereotyping. Well, after having been alerted to that, I was reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, which was one of Oprah's book choices that Oprah claimed was the most important one ever. And in chapter 31 of that book, Isabel, after having laid out this whole idea of caste and how it's the infrastructure of racism in the U.S., she has 2 chapters where she just tells stories. She doesn't analyze them. She doesn't, get all academic about them. She just tells the stories. And one of them is a story about an interaction between her, Isabel, and a white plumber. She had a flooded basement, and her basement had flooded within the period of time, about 18 months after both her husband and her mother had died. And when the plumber came, it was apparent that he didn't think she should be living in this neighborhood. And he didn't have much to say about her ability to analyze the situation. So he's very brusque and just said, well, let's get this over with. I want to get out of here. He told her sump pump was fine. And then he said you could buy a new one for this much, trying to, it was. Yeah. So she says at one point, I felt I had nothing to lose, so I threw a Hail Mary at his humanity. That's what she characterizes. Yeah. And she said something like, my mother died recently. Is your mother still alive? Okay, so that was her conversational move. My mother died recently. Is your mother still alive? That contains an offering and an invitation. Mm-hmm. And he remarkably responded in kind. No, my mother is still dead. She died when she was 52. And Isabel said, kind of following up, well, what about your dad or something like that? And he said, my dad's still alive. He lives in a home south of here, and he's as mean as they come. And that began a conversation, not a long one. At the end of that conversation, when the plumber left, Isabel described him as he walked up the stairs as momentarily family.
Hmm.
Now, so here's this second black-white relationship, started out very racist, transformed by the conversation. And as I looked at that conversation, once again, I saw what these people were engaged in without defining it this way, without making a big project out of it, just because they were connecting with each other. What they were doing was co-constructing uniquenesses. And that process empowered them to move beyond this toxic, tragic pattern of stereotyping. And so I thought, well, we can all do this. This isn't just them. And so what I'm working on is trying to clarify what was done and point to its impact. So I wrote a book called Dismantling Racism One-on-One, in which I talk about these two conversations and two others where that is either happening or, in one case, it's not happening, in an effort to clarify what's possible instead. When you get caught up in the stereotyping that I think is a part of most dehumanizing conversations, whether it's racism or sexism, ageism, any kind of dehumanizing, I'll just call it, there's this other option available.
To just, go right off of the language you use, which, just based on our conversation so far, I know you're intentional about the language of the book you've written of Dismantling Racism One-on-One. I'm curious about what you found or what makes you believe through these conversations that we can dismantle something that feels so large and systemic as racism one-on-one.
Right. And I'm glad you brought the word systemic in there because I think it's really crucial. I was trying to describe my interests a few weeks ago and to an audience online that included an African-American woman. And she really got angry with me because she felt I was suggesting that something as bad as black-white racism can be completely ameliorated if we just hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Right.
So, and she didn't want to listen anymore. And that was a real learning experience for me and painful.
Mm-hmm.
Systemic racism is incredibly powerful and omnipresent. I mean, I believe white supremacy is a descriptive term, not an evaluative one. I think we live, particularly in the US, but not exclusively, in a white supremacist society. And that's another way of saying systemic racism is dominant. One-on-one racism happens in that context.
Right.
I think the one-on-one interactions that I have found and foregrounded are instances of systemic issues. I think if we talk about a systemic perspective, we can talk about educational systems, law enforcement systems, mortgage banking systems, employment systems, all kinds of, the large complexes of human patterns and interactions. These instances that I'm talking about operate within those systems. And when I think about the system, let's just say the educational system, which I've lived in, and I think of, I wish the assumptions that are part of that system about the capabilities of students of color, I wish those could be changed. Those are inappropriate, inaccurate, dehumanizing, toxic, bad. I don't know how to do that. I don't know what I can do to change the system. I know I can change my own sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. And I do have the responsibility of changing my own sphere of influence consistently. That focuses me on interpersonal instances of racism. That's where my sphere of influence is lived out. And that's what I need to attend to. That's what happened between me and the Black woman that I had mentioned. And that's an unresolved problem in my own sphere of influence right now. Because there's an overlay of that is mansplaining. If I say to her, that's not what I meant, I'm mansplaining and I'm just defending. And so it's tricky to work that issue. And it exists between us in part, and it is systemic. So I think it's not that we turn our backs on systemic racism at all, but that here's an arena where individual choices can have the kind of impact that they did have in these real instances that I'm unpacking. And Jennifer and Ronald really did become friends. I mean, I saw them interact in front of all of us, and I read about Ronald going to Jennifer's daughter's soccer game and cheering her on, and vice versa. That they did that. They actually got involved in each other's family lives, and so on. I mean, Isabel, she chose her words carefully too, and to call the plumber momentarily family is significant. I mean, it's meaningful. So I think it's helpful for us to develop our own resources for individualizing difficult conversations so that we can move the relationships in those directions too. Learn from these models and apply them in our own lives.
Yeah, this again is where the interpersonal lens makes a lot of sense to me, because it is this both and, that it is happening on a systemic level and a relational level. And my studies were truly, like, my undergraduate degree is interpersonal communication. The other options at my university were organizational communication or public communication. But to me, interpersonal is the heart of all of it, because, what are our organizations if not just a bunch of human people trying to interrelate together? And so I see the way that they're still connected. It doesn't have to be, on an either or understanding. And then also maybe looking back and thinking about how meaning is made, it makes sense to me that part of the way that the systems that we exist under now that perpetuate racism were originally formed were one-on-one in interactions that perpetuated these ideas and eventually kind of grew to the system. And that's maybe a both and, from the top and bottom coming up, not to say it was just one-on-one. I think there's been systems of oppression in many, many ways, but it makes sense to me that one-on-one still speaks to the way that racism is perpetuated systemically. It is not negating that, in my understanding, at least.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it makes sense that that's maybe challenging for people to hear or understand or wrap their heads around, because it seems maybe too simple and too complex at the same time, where it's like, well, just in my conversations, I can dismantle racism, but also how in the world am I supposed to dismantle racism in my conversations? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is the distinction in my mind between simple and easy.
Yeah.
Sort of conceptually simple, offer and invite.
Right.
People, what I give out, what I take in, that kind of thing. And doing it, with a person of color who's very legitimately angry at people like me because of 600 years of interactions.
Mm-hmm.
How to do it in that actual happening, that actual event. That isn't easy at all. So conceptually it might be simple. Moves might be simple, but it isn't easy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, for some larger context, I'll share too that the series that I'm going to include this conversation as a part of I'm calling the Showing Up series. So think about how we show up to each other. Yeah. And it makes so much sense to me that all of your work can kind of fit under this umbrella of the series that I'm doing, because the question really is a difference in showing up, I think. And like, for example, the story you're referencing of your experience of this moment of tension, of different ways of seeing someone being upset with you, is that there's, the moment, which I think is what most people are more familiar with, is like moment of tension, moment of conflict, and then disperse and go into your own corners and stew in your feelings, rather than what another option is, which again, people just, I think a lot of times forget they have an option, is a leaning in. And maybe that's kind of that distinction in the showing up, is that if you can lean in a mutually kind of, trusting in truly co-constructing kind of way, this offer invitation on both sides. I'm curious if you maybe have some more thoughts or developed opinions about what that moment is of that, what changes really in the showing up that can lead us to co-constructing uniqueness.
Yeah, this is where the teacher in me, I want to think about, if I were working one-on-one with a client, or I were working in a undergraduate classroom, for example, what do you mean? Somebody would say, what do you mean? Give me an example, something like that. And so, I think that's really important. I like your metaphor, leaning in, because it suggests, for me, as I think about it, suggests both the vulnerability part of some disclosure, which helps me be present in the moment as a human being, as a person, not just a role, not just a professor or a evaluator, some a manager or a cop or a judge or whatever. Present as a human being, and leaning in the sense of attempting to hear better, listening, leaning in so that I can capture everything. Not capturing that, I don't like that. So I can sense, I can be impacted by the other person is saying to me. Both of those are there in that leaning in notion. In the Dismantling Racism one-on-one book, there are 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8, about 3 ways to do that are fairly concrete. And the offer and invite is one distinction that you carry forward as you kind of think about these behaviors, if you want to call them that, or moves. I don't know if that's too manipulative sounding, or strategies, tactics, skills. So offering and inviting reflections is the first one. By reflection, I mean thinking about our thinking. So we say, for example, I'm probably being too hard on her. Or, gosh, I did a lousy job of being a parent in that situation. Or, I could have been clearer. Or, I feel really good about that. That was, I think they caught some sense of my enthusiasm, whatever. Those are reflections, and I think they're very common. We're engaged in self-analysis and self-evaluation all the time. So a reflections give a glimpse of who we are as human beings, way beyond being a stereotype. And so if we offer and invite a reflection, which is what I think Isabel did. My mother died recently. I've been thinking about my mother's death. I've been missing her. I've been caring about. This is some vulnerability, some disclosure. Is your mother still alive? An open-ended question, and then silence. Shut up and listen. Make room.
Yeah. You're building perfectly. You don't know it, but you're building perfectly on the previous conversations in this series. Is that my first one is holding space, is the conversation with Dr. Aminata Cairo. And then the conversation that will come out before this one is with John Chetro Sivos on critical thinking. And so we just spoke about metacognition and thinking about your thinking. And so it's wonderful how this is coming
exactly.
together.
Metacognition, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's okay. So that's one of the three.
Yeah. Offering and inviting
reflection. Offering and inviting choices is the second one. I think choices is another indicator of reflection of manifestation of embodiment of who we are as persons, humans. I mean, we're not just our choices, but our choices are an important part of who we are, what we wear today, how we show up physically, and how we show up. Becky and I, my wife and I, were at the Pride Festival this weekend. It's important for us to show up there, in that sense, to have our bodies be there as and present. So offering and inviting choices, and verbally and non-verbally, it might be what's really important to me is bloop. I don't have to say my choice is to. I mean, you can say what's important to me, that gives a priority, which is a choice. You can say right after this, I'm going to, or what brought me here was the choice that I made for this in this present situation. You can report on that choice. There's a variety of different ways to verbally and non-verbally talk about, make available, offer, put on the table choices that I've made. And then to invite another choice. What's important to you? What's most important to you? So that's the second of the three specific ways to do this. And the third is offering and inviting feelings. And I think that's kind of straightforward, that when we name, disclose, label a feeling that's genuine for us, I'm excited about this. I mean, that's an example. It's a pretty low, vulnerable, low risk one, but it could be a very important one.
Yeah, I think still vulnerable. That just to share a quick story, I think about that a lot for I'll only speak for, my generation really, and growing up, and maybe this is, true of a lot of people in their youth, but it's almost like the cool thing to do is act like you don't care about anything. I think caring about something is a very vulnerable act and a beautiful thing, and another thing, I invite people to lean into. So even though, yes, maybe in some context saying I'm excited about this is not vulnerable, I think in some ways it is, or in other moments it would be.
That's good.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm hard of hearing, and wear hearing aids. And I heard when you just said that, I wasn't certain whether I heard cool or cruel. And I thought, well, that's kind of a delicious irony. Either of those would be fine. Both of those are true. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Disinterested, disconnected, protecting myself.
Right.
So any kind of feeling. I think the learning, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, the difference between, well, I feel it's really important you do that. That's not a feeling. That's an opinion, and it's an evaluation. I feel sad. That's a feeling. I feel happy. I think we need to fine-tune our feeling articulation competencies, however you want to put that.
Yes.
Because a whole lot passes for the expression of feeling that's anything but. And if you think about, how can I be present as an individual? How can I be present as who I am uniquely in this situation? And be present in a way that helps encourage the other, that gives oomph to the invitation, that gives potency to the invitation, helps the other feel, yeah. And like the plumber, to reciprocate in kind. The plumber, I mean, I don't know. It was wonderful what happened between them. She started it, and he was absolutely necessary. He was, the title of the chapter in the book is "When the Plumber's a Bigot." That's not fair to the plumber. I think he showed. That's my title, not Isabel's. Anyway, so those are three, and the academic proclivity for Trinitarian responses means there's always going to be three of everything, right?
Right.
But I stopped with three because I thought if we could just learn those three options, then hopefully we'd feel we have some resources. I've got something I can draw on when I get in this uncomfortable situation, where I want to invite co-constructing uniquenesses, where I want to try to move in that direction.
I love the language piece of all of this, and I could just talk forever about, the language. So it works for me, but I'm thankful. And one of the things that's sticking with me from what you're saying is, in addition to now thinking that I want to intentionally use co-constructing, I'm really thankful for you using offering and inviting together, because I've talked a lot about inviting and making space, holding space, like I just talked about with Aminata, but what are the piece of communication that is how it acts as an invitation for other people. But I've never made the note that you can't, that invitation doesn't work without that same offering, almost this idea of like vulnerability begets vulnerability, that you can't, it's challenging, maybe not a kind of non-starter to ask someone to be vulnerable or to invite that without showing up fully yourself too. And so it makes sense to me for everything you're talking about with co-constructing uniqueness. It is a truly co-constructive process where each person has to show up in their full humanity, in their full personhood. And not to say that every interaction is you turning over every corner of your heart and sharing your deepest vulnerabilities and traumas. It doesn't have to be that. But there is a kind of like an idea that was shared with me early on in this podcast is from Alexandria Jagiello, who is a fellow for the CMM Institute. And she talked about felt trust. And that's been kind of come up for me again recently, thinking about that. And that seems very key to, what's the prerequisite, the context have to be in order for people to lean in, and maybe some felt trust would be part of that.
As a person who calls himself white, working in the arena of diversity, equity, and inclusion is uncomfortable. And it's really important, I think, for people like me who try to do something about this, so that we expect that rather than resist it.
Right.
Yeah, felt trust with a recognition that that's going to have to be achieved. I'm not always going to feel trustworthy, trusting. Can I mention that I'm looking for collaborators on where this project, this larger project that right now I'm calling the Beyond Empathy Project, by which I mean I'm taking the notion of empathy because it is so widely understood and so important to so many different people, academics and practitioners of various sorts, and lay people. The focus on empathy also involves grouping. I mean, it's obviously way different from stereotyping, way different. And John Carson, a philosopher, a personalist philosopher, argues specifically, empathy is based on similarity. When I can walk a mile in your moccasins, it's because I see some similarity between you and me. And my focus is on difference, uniqueness. And I do not mean that as an alternative to similarity. I think empathy is vitally important. And it strikes me that, I'm kind of jumping through this here, but just to take the notion of dating, relationship development through the dating process. A person might attempt to date another person because of their commonalities. I really like the commonalities we have. And the closest human relationships, I believe, move from commonalities to, this is the most remarkable person I've been with. I've never been with anybody who I want to be with this person the rest of my life, or even in organizations, this company complements ours in this market space more than any other. Uniqueness. So the idea of commonality is important. And as we move closer, and here I think I go back to these conversations, these people move closer, even though you wouldn't have expected them to at all. As you move closer, uniquenesses are vital. And so there is this phenomenon I just call the cisgendered and heterosexual version of it is she's the one, which is my experience of it. She's the one, the unique person. Okay, so when we get to the reason for proposing this is when we get to the one, we're at the opposite of stereotyping again. We're not grouping. So commonality and difference, to add the notion of difference to the notion of commonality, to encourage difference thinking. How's this person I'm interacting with unique? I think dialogue in its best manifestations, events, instances includes that. I'm very conscious now that I'm an old guy, okay? And you're a younger person. And I really like the points of, oh yeah, that was important for me to learn too. And I hadn't thought about that. Yes, that's partly a result of her perspective being just plain younger than mine. Both. Okay, well, so the project has possibilities, academic possibilities, clinical possibilities, educational possibilities, where all kinds of things could be done, including lesson plans, graphic instructional materials, podcasts, webinars, presentations, TEDx presentations, articles, convention paper, all kinds of. And I'm looking for people who are interested in picking up and running with some part of this project that intrigues them. And if anybody wants to email me, I can send them my current outline of this Beyond Empathy project that's meant to be just heuristic ideas. Can you give them my email address, or should I say it, or what?
Yeah, you can say it right now, and I'll make sure that it's in the description of the episode too for people to find.
It's just Stewart, JSTEWART 2375 @gmail.com.
Wonderful. I love it's very CMM-ish, that it is the nature or the process and also the content to talk about the co-constructing, that it truly is a, collaborative effort there. And I'm glad you bring us to the point of uniqueness in the context or in relationship with empathy and what that distinction is. And that's something that, in preparing for this conversation, I was really thinking about, because that was, new things you're teaching me or new distinctions you're making for me. And like you said, there's a place for both.
Yeah. Well, both are important, I think.
Yeah. But because there's been a huge emphasis on empathy, it's like an over-functioning, under-functioning dynamic. Like, just for the purposes of what I'm saying right now, let's assume there's, 100% cultural attention, or, whatever you would say. If 90% is focused on empathy, then by default, only 10% is focused on uniqueness. So I think that maybe your work is about a balancing out of that to create uniqueness. And it's interesting because I do think it's something we already do. Like you're talking about the she's the one effect, or whatever you're describing that as. We do already celebrate, co-construct, acknowledge, live in our differences, live in the uniqueness.
Yes.
But we don't maybe pull it out or draw attention to it, or we're not aware of it as much. I wonder, is that your experience too? How are you kind of conceptualizing that relationship between empathy and uniqueness? Is it kind of like how I've described it now, or do you see it differently?
No, it's as you said. Now I'm just trying. I had an experience recently. I have a good friend who's a retired psychiatrist, and his life has been I mean, in the clinical parts of his life, living into the empathic impulse. And I had him read a piece that's called Through Empathizing to Co-constructing Uniquenesses. And he read the piece and we talked about it. And basically what his feedback to me was, I think it's all empathizing. He read a draft. I think it's all empathizing. And I said, Roger, no. And so I went back then and wrote some more that tried to make it more clear where the distinctions, where the differences were thematic in the interactions that I was talking about. I think he's right up to a point, and then there is this other point where I think he's doing it too, and I think he's not seeing that he's doing that, and it makes sense. So there's a project there, and it's definitely both and.
Yeah.
It's both and. Empathizing may be totally functional for some relationships.
Right, yeah.
And the closest ones, if we want to move in that direction, have got this other she's the one element where co-constructing uniquenesses is really important. And this is only one way to think about the whole business. I would, part of my project is to just encourage people to think about uniquenesses. And that goes back to, again, I hate to repeat this, but opposite of stereotyping.
Yeah.
I really believe in the pernicious, toxic impact of stereotyping, and that it's not pole, a simple way of understanding dehumanization, that there's so much objectification going on. Simple way of understanding that you're treating people as objects or you're grouping them unfairly. Try doing the opposite of that. Try doing uniqueness thinking for a while. It's going to be therapeutic. It's going to be helpful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I'm thinking about a difference between empathy and co-constructing uniqueness is, let's say someone shares an experience they had with you. I think empathy is, oh, I understand that and I hear you because I share that experience. Co-constructing uniqueness might seem more like someone sharing an experience with you and you say, that is not something I understand because I don't have that experience, but I believe you. I think that maybe is an important thing, that when we tell people, I think about this in CMM-ish language when we talk about meaning making, is that, like, I think we've kind of danced around this, or you've referenced it, that it's not really up for a value judgment, really, or it's not really up for discussion necessarily if someone says, well, this is what something means to me. And then what if we just believed each other, when we tell each other what things mean to us or what our experiences have been, rather than, I have to have had that experience to have understood what you possibly are talking about. But that, because I'm thinking about dialogue, so many things are floating through my head right now in this conversation, but dialogue and my understanding of that really being living in the tension between holding your own ground of your own story and experiences, and at the same time being profoundly open to others and their ways of being. That, maybe part of the function, the real, tangible, well, what does it look like for us in our daily lives of co-constructing relational uniqueness, is believing each other when we tell each other what something means to us.
I really like your reference to what my language for the being open and holding your own ground is, letting the other person happen to you while holding your own ground.
That's good. That's so good. Yeah.
Barnett and I talked about that because I borrowed that language from something that Buber wrote, or maybe Friedman wrote about Buber. And Barnett and I interacted a fair amount. I knew him fairly well. And anyway, I can remember a conversation where we were sort of going back and forth about, it's all metaphorical, right? I mean, which kind of metaphors work for you? And I really like let the other happen to you because of the sort of embodied picture of that. So, yeah, but yes, absolutely. I agree with what you're saying. And I think sometimes you can resonate with the other's experience and bring your own experience to it that is similar but somehow different. And then you're talking about uniqueness.
Yeah.
That it doesn't have to be a different experience. I've been dropped before too. I've been stood up before, or something more positive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, I'm really, really thankful for this conversation today. And just as we wrap up, I want to give one last invitation. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about today that you wanted to make sure we did, or what do you want to leave people with at the end here?
Well, no, you're a very good interviewer, and you did a really remarkably good job of assimilating what I sent you beforehand, so that what we've been talking about is at the heart of the matter for me.
Good. Yeah.
So I
Thank
really
you.
like that very much.
Thank you.
I also believe there's something here. I guess the one thing we didn't talk about is what some research has shown are the problems with an empathy focus, that
Yeah.
in health sciences, particularly with underserved populations, health sciences frequently, according to the research, believe they have empathized successfully with patients, and they haven't.
Interesting.
My experience of this is I have heard people of color say, please save me from another white liberal telling me, I know exactly how you feel. You don't know. Huh? And I hear that, and I don't believe I do know. Huh? And the empathy impulse, if you've been trained in your clinical practice rotation to be empathic, that's what you want to be, despite the fact that you may be wealthy, white, young, and all the other things that keep you from being able to the end, and so on. That's one mention. But no, what I want to leave people with is I'm really looking for collaborators, and I hope people, young graduate students who are inclined in this direction anyway, I'm happy to just collaborate in whatever I can do. The older folks who see something possible in this, complement the study of similarities with the study of differences, however it works. I will be gone before too long on some other plane, and I hope this project could continue somehow.
It's exciting to be a part of the conversation, knowing that it is the beginning of a conversation. I think, yeah, that you're kind of laying the groundwork for something that can hopefully be big, and brings me back to what we spoke about earlier, is the one-on-one. And you have it, we each have our own influence over our social sphere, is that, yeah,
Right.
You, John Stewart, are not going to dismantle racism by yourself in your one-on-ones, but each of us and each of our one-on-ones together, it is this kind of snowballing effect, ripple effect of if it can just ripple out and out and out. And it is, truly collaborative with everybody. So I'm thankful for the invitation you're offering to people.
Yes. And as you talked about that, I really want to be careful that an African-American friend of mine told me very assertively a number of years ago, John, we didn't create this racism. It's not our responsibility to undo it. You need to get your shit together. And I think that's true. And I think the systems embroil all of us in it in ways we can't control. Mm-hmm. So yours and my best impulses are not going to be enough either. And these are, I think, steps that could be positive, that could move in positive directions, so long as we aren't unrealistic about their possibilities and our power.
Yeah. Are you kind of making that distinction between like what exists beyond like the impulse is the like choice of the leaning in of the co-constructing uniqueness? Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been truly wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with John. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on. These act as a next turn for us, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the question I would have you think about is, what is your sphere of influence, and how can you change how you're showing up to it? Also, I encourage you to connect with John if you are interested in collaborating with him in any capacity around this work with Co-constructing Uniqueness. He said his email earlier, and it's also in the show notes. And as this is the last episode in our series, I invite you not only to reflect on the question I've offered for this episode, but also to reflect across the past 4 episodes together in context. What did you learn in each episode individually? And what have you learned by listening to these 4 conversations together? I see these 4 topics fitting together so well. And one way that I'm thinking about it is that metacognition, like we talked about with John Chetrosivos, is where we start, right? Before we take our actions, we have to change our thinking, or at least build awareness. Kind of this idea that building awareness is the first step to being able to make change. Then where we would go from this foundation of embodied critical thinking is to show up to our relationships in a way that goes beyond empathy and celebrates uniqueness. And the way to do this would be to practice holding space. John said those words today, and that's what we talked about with Aminata. And then I'm thinking that throughout all of this, we'd be using a polyvagal informed approach like we learned from Michael to stay regulated and to stay in touch with our body and our physiological experience, and also to become aware of the physiological experiences of others. To me, these episodes seem to fit together like a puzzle, and I'd love to hear about what you are taking away from this month of conversations too. So you can reach out to me to share your reflections, as well as any of your own questions or ideas. I would welcome all and any of that. And you can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all of those places are in the show notes. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, and most importantly to me, share this episode. Think about who you would want to invite into the conversation, who this episode could be meaningful for, and really while you're at it, share all the episodes of this series and invite someone into the conversation with us. I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward those better social worlds we hope to create. One example of another initiative is the Cosmo Activities, which are a series of educational, social, emotional resources that can be accessed for free at www.cosmoactivities.com. We're also working on building out more resources for people interested in learning about CMM and what it means to take a communication perspective. So I've created a bunch of videos, infographics, and obviously this podcast is a great resource too. So now you can find all of that at www.cmminstitute.substack.com. And links to both of those will be in the show notes if you just want to find them there. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.